I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our free online community conversation on multi-generational trauma in the Americas. Now, my name is Dr. James Newell. Just go by James normally, but happy to have you all. By a series of odd circumstances, I recently became the director of the Depth Psychology Alliance. Happy to do it. Happy to be involved with so many good, thoughtful, and just like-minded, as Bonnie likes to say, like-minded people. So we've been doing these for a while because a big part of the mission of the Depth Psychology Alliance is to cultivate a dynamic global gathering place for the exploration and exchange of the ideas, principles, and practices of depth psychology. So it's something that we all have in common, and in the spirit of the mission of the Depth Psychology Alliance, over the years we've hosted a number of these community conversations, exploring questions like what is depth psychology and how can we as depth psychologists respond to important cultural issues like gun violence and racism from a depth psychology perspective, which is a very different perspective from a lot of the normal approach. As we know from depth psychology, what's going on cognitively is one thing, and the things that intrude from the unconscious are often, if not as important, often more important. So our purpose in addressing these issues has not been to discover the solutions to broad cultural issues, but rather to explore their origins and bring the methods, principles, and practices of depth psychology into the public sphere, to seek out and discuss and explore possibilities. And so that perhaps one day, working together to bring unifying, healing experiences onto the public stage, rather than bringing divisiveness and polarization, or rather than focusing on the polarization, we might be able to hold the tension of the opposites and look for that healing third thing that will transform our cultural dilemmas. And so we, to that end, try to just get together and talk about it and think about it. And also to that end, I like to ask everyone, especially today, to avoid taking a political stance or even looking at situations from a political point of view. For my part, personally, I don't believe in political solutions. I only believe in spiritual solutions, and my belief is that when hearts change, circumstances change, and all other change will happen, will follow from that naturally. You don't have to share that belief with me, but that's kind of where I'm coming from and why I'm focusing on, and why we as an organization are focusing on this idea of multi-generational trauma in the Americas. Certainly most people alive today have some connection to multi-generational trauma. Most of our families carry trauma in one way or another. Until very recently, the world was nothing but trauma after trauma. People didn't live very long. We've been very fortunate that now many of us have some space in our lives where we can reflect on this, we can work on our traumas, try to heal, and try to bring some normalcy to our lives. So I think it's for me, it's always a lens through which I see things. And for me, on the cultural level, certainly on the North and South American continents, a more cogent, horrific, and widespread multi-generational trauma could not be found than those experienced by the native peoples of these two continents. And although the overt genocide may have, for the most part, been discontinued, the trauma and oppression and discrimination for many people, for many native people, continues to this day. I won't go into details on that, but it doesn't take much research to see how true that is. So what this means to me personally, I grew up in an area where there was, in New England, very near places where there were massacres, and people would kind of be amazed at these different historical sites. And as a survivor of trauma myself, I spontaneously recognize that I have personally benefited from the trauma of the native people, for example, of South Carolina, where I live. I live on and own, according to the governmental, as they like to say, the settler colonial laws, I live on the ancestral land of native people. Probably the Uwakaba people, although there's several tribes who lived in this area and had more or less possession of the hunting and fishing areas here. So because of that, I'm moved to ask, what are the archetypal dimensions of multi-generational cultural trauma? How does that history of this land on which I live, how does that traumatic history impact contemporary culture? How can modern people like myself respond responsibly and effectively to their own cultural histories, which is, for me, as I've described, I grew up in a place where there was a great history of bloodshed and oppression and basically stealing of land, and here where I live now. How can we best address issues of cultural chaos from the perspective of depth psychology? And to me, it's very clear, and I'm focusing, and we're focusing today on this issue of native peoples and the land, and this very, very old history of just such a complex history. We'll just leave it at that. But there's also the history of African Americans being brought here, the economy being built on essentially free labor, and millions of people just died coming over here, and then of course millions more were oppressed and of course died in servitude. And Indians also, the native people, and some native people prefer to be called Indians, so I use them interchangeably. But they also, there's a huge early slave trade in Indians and native people, and many people now empirically say that the the big industrial boom of Europe was funded by the gold and silver that was taken by enslaved Indians out of the mountains of the Andes and in South America. So how can those of us who feel that the perspectives of depth psychology can have a positive cultural influence begin to inspire positive change in the world? Can we bring all these together? Well, they're huge issues, obviously. I'm not going to answer them, and we're not going to answer them today, but bringing depth psychology into the conversation about these kind of things, I think, is really important. And that's our mission with the Depth Psychology Alliance, and that's what we're going to do. So however, all of you here today joining us, and again, I thank you all for coming, those of you who just arrived a little late maybe. However we might personally answer these questions, I want to encourage each of you, as we go through this, just consider the idea. Many times I say when you work on a dream or you do some depth work, you want to do something concrete in the world. So I encourage people, one of the reasons for doing this is also to encourage people to do something concrete, maybe donate to a Native American service organization, or maybe go out and do some work yourself. But think about concretely addressing these things, and the Depth Psychology Alliance has now taken on, just as one of the things we do, supporting an organization called the Native American Heritage Association. There's lots more on that on the Depth Psychology Alliance. I'm not going to belabor it, but I do encourage you to, even if it's just as a ritual act, to think about making some concrete movement in that direction. So what I want to do now is introduce our panel. We've got several learned and very wise and experienced people with us today, and I want to just quickly do that so we can go through and just get other people's ideas and impressions. We I've sent out an email recently with some more detailed biographies, and many of the panel have websites with links there. You can go and find out more. So I'm just going to briefly say, we're very fortunate. I just met yesterday Tom, and Tom, you have to correct me on your pronunciation. I don't know if it's Ayena or Elena. But Tom is very, very experienced in, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay.
So did I mispronounce your name?
Oh, you got it right the second time. Yeah.
Oh, good, Ayena. Good. Okay, so Tom is very experienced. I want to also introduce Eva Ryder is with us, and Donna May is with us, and I know Mark Sipwitz is here. I don't know if Gary has arrived yet. Do you hear Gary? Gary Bobroff. all board members, except Tom is the guest specialist with us today, and all of us are board members of the Depth Psychology Alliance. And what I'm going to do is ask everyone, just take 5 minutes or so, each of the board members and Tom, take 5 minutes or so and just reflect on these questions, and then we're going to ask people to join us. And if you have questions, you can unmute after we've completed going through the panel. Just unmute and we'll try to have a discussion going. So, Tom, thanks for coming.
Well, thanks. First of all, James, I want to thank you and the board of BPA for bringing this important topic forward. And I also want to express my deep gratitude to Bonnie Bright for all her amazing foundational work with the Alliance and getting this off the ground. So I want to respect the people that have brought this forward, and I think that's pretty important to do. So I don't want to be too academic on this. I want to kind of keep it in the experiential field. I started working in the field of restorative justice a little more than 30 years ago. And what it's led me to in terms of my own work was really looking at the whole idea from different cultural perspectives. What's been introduced as multi-generational trauma. You know, it was coined in the Native community by Maria Braveheart as historical trauma back in the 80s. Transgenerational trauma, which came out of some of the research involving Volkan and his work. So I think there's a lot of cultural context around the work. In the depth psychology field, of course, we know about people such as Thomas Singer, Sam Kimball's work on cultural complexes. I think they all have had an influence on some of the work I've been able to do. I've been privileged to work with. A lot of my work in the last 20 years has involved deep violence. And it started out with working on everything from murder cases where we've done large 30, 40 person, what we call sentencing circles. So it's had a number of overtones of violence involved in it, gang-related shooting deaths. But what I began to see over time was, given where I live, which is in New Mexico, we've got a 400-year history of colonization that's been marked by a number of major episodes. And I'm always amazed to see just the ways in which these historical features play themselves out in contemporary forms. And the symbols, the narratives, the paradoxical types of events that happen today. And just to give you just a way of framing this, I sent James a piece that was in the paper this week out here. We have a practice here of, you know, because we're a tricultural community here in New Mexico, largely tricultural. Certainly there are other cultures involved here, but the three major communities. One of them involves, you know, one of the celebrations that goes on today is the colonization of Native Americans through one of the ideas of ritual involving Spanish conquistadors. Now, this, you know, to think that it basically is limited to that is just not true, because we've had, you know, we've experienced, matter of fact, destiny. You know, we're also part of the nuclear aftermath. And I really believe that expansion of the nuclear proliferation here in New Mexico has had widespread consequences on communities and on cultures here. So we have multifaceted 400-year series that play themselves out. And I think contemporary phenomena that we see here, whether it's the aftermath of the Trinity test site, where we've got 3 generations of cancer right now down south of Alamogordo, the cancer related to the development of a number of nuclear related issues. But so we have our share of cultural conflict here. And I think it plays itself out in some of the phenomena we see around violence, around domestic violence, around gang-related issues. I see them as part of a continuum. And I think some of the more effective responses, and what I'm really interested in hearing from people on the call today, are not just how in the Jungian world we tend to want to just diagnose the situation, but I'm very curious to hear what types of practices are we using to address some of these issues. And what's the role of liberation psychology, depth psychology in the, in these practices? Because I see more and more. It's not uncommon for me to be involved in a facilitation role in, say, a gang-related shooting death, when the mother of the young man that was killed walks into the circle. Now, get that there's maybe 25, 30 people in a circle, including lawyers, family members from both sides, victim sides, offender sides, judges. A judge will be there, a district attorney will be there, the defense attorney will be there, and the mother walks in of the young man who was killed and offers a dream as the opening of this circle. Her son came to her that morning in a dream. And already we're in a different reality. We're not in the law anymore. We're in a place of a more reflective, a deeper container that we're building at this point. And so we're being informed by that other world. And so I'm always impressed with the ways in which images, symbols, curiosities, all the things that justice is not, finds its way into the room. And how the ability to build that container to kind of hold this tension, as James mentioned at the outset, the tension of opposites, to build secure containers so that the best I can describe it as an alchemical process. When you introduce Negredo, whether it's historical events or contemporary events, we're introducing a state of Negredo where heat is applied and requires a different kind of engagement. So I'm always heartened to see, and I'm very, very grateful to the people who have the courage to step into this type of work, because it's unknown. And we're working with historical factors, cultural factors that have depth and have meaning to them. And they transcend what we understand in our justice systems today, in our public engagement strategies. And I can talk more about that a little bit later, but I'll stop here because I've just seen some extraordinary work done by communities who are dealing with contemporary issues, but bringing in these methodologies that really allow for a different kind of conversation that are more heart-centered, soul-centered. And I really would enjoy hearing some of the participants and what you've experienced in this realm as well.
Thank you, Tom. That's what a beautiful story. The idea of wouldn't it be nice if we had we couldn't start a legal proceeding until somebody had a dream about it? Wouldn't that be a nice way to do it? It's there's so many things that come naturally to some people that just are also, I don't want to just single out indigenous people, but certainly taking dreams seriously often comes naturally to indigenous people, and there are others of us who have been so trained on a rational, hyper rational level that the idea of letting something like that in just seems hysterical. So thank you, and I know there's much more you can share. I want to go around to the different people in the panel, and Donna, have you any thoughts about this theme or in your work? Or I know storytelling is something that works right in there with the dream telling, and Donna and Mark work together to do their Seeding Soul Stories workshops.
Well, thank you, James, and it's an honor to be part here in the conversation. And Tom, thank you for your beautiful opening. It opened my heart even more fully to the conversation. I'm thinking, as always, in story, and so I have a couple different stories, if I could. One has to do with my personal story. My main line has been here many generations, and through my genealogy, I know that among many of my ancestors raped and pillaged across the landscape from the south, the east and south, into California, and were part of the genocide of the Indians, particularly as they made their way from Texas to New Mexico to Arizona. And that's part of my story. And also part of my story is like my grandfather, who was a flaming racist, who, if you weren't white and a Protestant, there was something wrong with you. And I grew up in that kind of container. Remembering when I was young, when All in the Family was on the TV, and Archie Bunker, and us laughing and saying, "Grandpa, you're on the TV." And holding, as I know, the importance to owning through my story, through my generations that I know of, story, and using ritual and story in order to begin to tell the truth, so there can be a healing, so that the things are not suppressed but are able to come forward. So that's one short piece that I wanted to say about my personal story. My professional story as a therapist, particularly for the last 20 years, in the far northern California, Siskiyou County, the home of the Karuk, the Yurok, and the Shasta, among other tribal nations, and having the honor to bear witness to their dreams and their stories, and the importance to having a container to be able for them to tell what their personal stories that are often filled with trauma that includes forcible removal from their homes and sent to the schools, rape, and the ravages of addiction of all sorts for multi-generations. But also, to the other piece I wanted to say is through the work of, again, ritual and having a means to kind of hold. I love, Tom, how you talked about the container, an alchemical container to hold these opposites, as James, you mentioned as well, to be able to transform and to heal on multiple levels. And I was honored about 2 years ago to be able to be invited. The Crooks brought up Dr. Eduardo Duran, who talks a lot about the need not only through ritual and individual healing, but also to begin to start to talk about the blood debt on the land itself, and to incorporate ways of healing and transformation through ritual, again, at the various places where there was massive bloodshed. In particular, because this is where I live, where the troops came in and really massacred. Like, there's very few Shasta members left, for instance, because of what happened here. And the defensiveness of people of the over culture, the white culture, who came in and took over this land. We need to be able to have a communication about what is the truth, and do it in a way where, again, it comes out of the shadows, comes out of the depths, so that we can start to be able to heal from this. Or, in my opinion, when I have both people of all types come into my office or into my classes, they're talking about that pain and devastation. We continue to carry it forward if there's not a way to start to acknowledge it and heal from it. So that's kind of what I wanted to bring to the conversation.
Thank
that
you,
I think
Donna.
is
Yeah, thank you. No, that that it also speaks to some of what Tom asked about, wanted to hear about ways to address these things in a concrete way and not just in a sort of an abstract way, which has been my sort of my starting point, anyways. And the idea of stories and certainly grief. I was in our conversation yesterday. I was mentioning to Tom that there's a beautiful passage in the Tao Te King. Where they say that the victor should be the one who mourns, not the one who celebrates and you know, brags, and in other words becomes inflated. There's a tendency for a victor to become inflated, and we certainly as a culture are very, very inflated and not down in the depths of actually realizing that whatever positives we seem to have reaped from all of this, there's a dark side which has got to come out at some point. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, James. I forgot to mention, this is my passion, is using storytelling in community. So that's what I do a lot of, both with kids at risk as well as adults coming together to write and tell their stories and then share it in community, and how powerful and healing that is when that's done in a sacred way, in a safe container, and in a non-judgmental way. So thank you.
Yeah, respectful way. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the yeah, that's something that that we need on all levels, but certainly on this deep level. Thank you, Donna. Donna's been a board member for many, many years, and she works with Mark Sipwitz. You still here, Mark? I know he's here somewhere.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hey, hi.
Hey. Well, thanks everyone for gathering here. I'm so glad we're taking this opportunity to ritualize our connection to this material, our interest in this material, our inquiry of this material. I think it's really important. I'm glad James put up on the Alliance another suggestion for ritualizing our concern and our interest in coming to terms with multi-generational trauma through making donations to this heritage fund. Ritual is important in my life and in my practice. Just naming at the top here that feeling a bit scattered. It's been a busy 24 hours. Maybe there's something on the personal level kind of coming through for me. The top of mind things are me doing an athletic event yesterday and having had many physical kind of accidents in my life, sort of traumatic events that were hard to come through. And I kind of re-traumatized a thumb of mine last night. It was very unexpected, and went to bed with that, and then woke up several times in the night with bears in the neighborhood getting into the garbage. Bears, images of deep soul, and through their hibernating, through their furriness, just a deep connection to psyche and soul and spirit, and rummaging through our garbage. Geez, what could that be? Today, working with some young men in transition in a residential house where I work, a lot of them with some heavy duty addiction issues and substance abuse. Having come to terms with some ways in which that's not any longer working their lives, trying to get their lives back on track. Working with a man today, sharing a dream. A dream of being caught in a doorway, trying to get through, and only through yelling could he overcome and move through some transitional place in a dream that was filled with opportunity in terms of many ancestral houses that he's lived in his life, and just really stuck there. And something about this yelling, transforming all white walls into color, and confronting an image in front of him that was very difficult. Makes me very emotional right now, feeling the connection to our work with Indigenous peoples, So wanting to name too that we're all on the spectrum of trauma and victimization and perpetration. And I spend a fair amount of time feeling as though I'm not so much on the perpetration end of the spectrum, but feeling so called through this call for us to discuss this and the call of our time to come to terms with this history. It's just been so rich and vivid for me to imagine into what this discussion needs to be and where it needs to go because of the offering of a space for it, and to come to terms with depth psychology's recognition that we're built of complexes and the ways in which any trauma is a complex, and that our complexes will possess us and show up in really unfortunate ways if we don't own our complexes. And a part of owning the complexes is rehistorying ourselves. History is just a collection of stories, and we need to retell this story of the origin of these lands and the settling of these lands and the trauma associated with it. So I really want to hear others. I'm so thankful for this gathering. I know good will come of it. I imagine in some way that we're all touching on different touch points, and that we can gather again in a future date or have a string of conversation that we'll be able to follow up on in different ways. The last image and story that's been central to me thinking about this week is that meeting of Young with the fabled meeting of Young in Taos, New Mexico with Mountain Lake, an indigenous man confronting Carl Jung and saying, "We don't understand you white people, you only think with your heads," and Dr. Jung naively saying, "Of course, how else would we do it?" And him saying, "We think with our hearts, and we don't understand this thinking with the head," and feeling the call to our democracy to begin thinking with our hearts more, the call to individuate and mature our democracy to, in a Jungian or depth psychological perspective, come to terms with the four functions, the four personality types that are available to us, and some ways in which our ancestral personality origin as a nation might be kind of petty and kind of disembodied and maybe lost from the heart. And just when questing and dreaming into this, coming across an old essay of James Hillman's, went in discussion with the great female Jungian psychologist, Maria von Franz, about personality types. They did a book that I think they published in, I think it was 2009. And he's in this quick 2-sentence, 3-sentence excerpt, he's identifying the limitations of a dominant functioning thinking, and coming to terms with the theory of Jungian psychology that the opposing function or personality type to thinking is feeling. And so some culture, some individual who is too dominant in thinking can be very inferior or struggle with feelings and material of the heart. And Hillman says, the inferior feeling is loaded with anger and rage and ambition and aggression, as well as with greed and desire. Here we find ourselves with huge claims for love, with massive needs for recognition, and discover our feeling connection to life to be one vast expectation composed of thousands of tiny, angry resentments. And I was just kind of shaken to my roots when investigating this question of what the original personality type of the America, our Northern America perhaps is, and ways in which this inferior functioning feeling might be manifesting in this way that Hillman describes, so full of rage, so full of destruction, and so so in need of love underneath it all. So
Yeah,
nothing else
yeah,
from me. That's
yeah.
that.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah,
Sure.
that is very appropriate, and it's so when someone is in that, when someone's constellating that rage, anger, also grasping, he might have said, a lot of grasping in the consciousness of the culture, and it's hard to get people to take seriously the importance of not only history in general, but history in which we are the perpetrators. We're not the great heroes, but we're the ones who've done great damage and created great trauma. And owning that, nobody wants to own that, and especially if you're in a rage, it's the last thing you want to hear.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome, James. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for being here and for bringing a lot of feeling into the conversation. And I'm looking for Gary. I don't see Gary, but I know Eva is with us. How are you, Eva? I know you're there somewhere.
I'm here. Oh, you can't
Hi.
see me.
There you are.
Yeah.
Eva is a therapist in the San Francisco area and is also a board member for many years. And welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, this topic is really close to me in many ways. I am, like many of us, not from here. And I've mentioned that many times. I was actually born in Hungary. I grew up in Canada, and I've lived in the United States for 33 years. So, and I'm in Central California. So, I don't even know where to begin, but one of the topics that was, I mean, as a dream therapist myself, I mean, dream is ritual, has become ritual. I mean, and the imaginal realms, the way they appear through tarot and through dreams are something that I'm working with more and more. And I'm really, without the dream, I'm finding that even entering into my therapeutic relationships with people we're missing the depth without the dreams. The dreams just are, as you mentioned, I think that story you told, Mark, about the doorway, that it's a portal. And it's that allows us to be able to understand metaphorically. So that's very abstract, but in the way that this touches me, it's almost difficult to talk about, is because I am, in terms of intergenerational trauma, as I mentioned when on our meeting, James had said I ought to bring this up. I'm actually not exactly directly the child of Holocaust victims, but on my paternal side, my father's entire family was decimated in the Holocaust. So, my family were refugees from Hungary, and we escaped. And so I've always had that feeling of not belonging. I mean, it's a complex for me. And so that on a very personal level, it is what is. And I'm always aware of that. I mean, I entered school not speaking English. And in terms of the land, I came, also my journey took me to the mountains of Southern California initially, and then I went to New Mexico. And that was where my spiritual journey took me. And in New Mexico, that connection to the land is so powerful. And yet, at that time in my life, being an illegal alien Canadian, I was not. I was literally spit out. I felt like I was spit out by the land at that point, and that was very poignant. That's very poignant because. There was, a disconnect, I suppose, in I didn't belong. So the sense of none of us, we have all come here as immigrants somewhere down the line. And as I said, the Native peoples are the only people who, this was their land. And so there's a great sadness in a sense. Right now, because this whole conquistador energy that, of course, is very, in so much of the Americas, is palpable, but it's now it continues to spread right now, and on the planet, and so that's a really we're in a transition. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that the reason some of what you said, Tom, was so important to me is I did my undergraduate work on the transitional nature of the Renaissance, and how we shifted in consciousness from a very emotional kind of state to, as we moved into the age of reason, to the other extreme, and how it's necessary to move back to that trend, to that tension of the opposites, which is happening right now. It's necessary to move to a third transcendent phase, which would be an incorporating of feeling, thinking, and also of an emotional way of perceiving, and also this visual, rational state. And I was really struck yesterday. I was talking to somebody, I don't know if this relates completely, about how that's starting to happen, and we're in that birth canal right now, because Marshall McLuhan had talked about how we moved from a visual way of perceiving to a visual, rational, from emotional to non-rational to visual, and into kind of the 3D world, from a 2D world, from the religious to the secular world, from Middle Ages to the Renaissance. But now it was struck how, things like Audible, and how we're suddenly we're incorporating both the visual and the audio again. And that that storytelling has become so important now. And that storytelling connects us back into community and into the emotional state again. And I don't mean, I mean feeling perhaps more than emotional. So I was just struck by that yesterday. I thought, nobody's reading anymore. People are listening to Audible. So what does that mean in terms of how our consciousness is shifting, and how we are having to move back to a more feeling rooted way, and using our imagination, because when we're listening to stories or telling stories, then we're much more in the imagination than when we're watching television. So anyway, just some more thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you, Eva. And that when you mentioned the conquistador, also that kind of reminded me that, because I grew up in New England, I think a lot about the settler states there and the history of that, because that was all around me. And that was, the conquistador had this particular sense of being, sent by God, but the pilgrims had even a more strong sense of that not only was it, they were so paternal, and so they thought that they were not coming with a sword, but in fact they came with a bigger sword, because they had a sword that was propped up by this really, I don't want to say narcissistic, but a very, very self-important sense that they were better than the people that they were just horribly misusing. The Massasoit and those early people actually literally kept them alive, and then they just completely turned on them. And so from both sides of the country, you had this coming in, and the whole idea of the shifting of consciousness. And there is the plus. You very nicely encapsulated the plus side of how things are moving to a sort of a non-linear, non-rational sense, but that also means that, like, the truth is up for grabs, and whatever is, since nothing is provable, if you hear it said, then that's your proof. It's an odd state that we're in. Yeah. So my questions remain. Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Mark, and thank you, Donna, and thank you, Tom. My original questions remain, and I want to open it up to everybody who's joined us. What are the archetypal dimensions of multi-generational trauma? How it's particularly cultural trauma. How has this traumatic history that we're discussing impacted contemporary culture, or has it? I feel that it has, but you may have another take. How can we as modern people respond? That's Tom's question. My approach is very abstract, and one reason I was so excited that Tom could join us as he's had so much on the ground, concrete experience with really digging into those things, and what are some ways that we can do that. Storytelling is the one that's emerged a lot from Donna and Mark and Eva. So, and how can is it possible through depth psychology, and are there concrete ways that we can integrate the insights that we learn from history and from these theoretical positions and from diagnosis, as Tom was saying? How can we move that, or can we move that in a way to address and deal with chaos as things continue to split into these opposing factions? And how can we use depth psychology in a positive way to influence the culture? So that's my question, and I open it up to anybody. And certainly, if we don't hear from anyone, then I know, or I feel strongly that Tom has some more ideas he could share with us. But does anyone here, there's still another 30 people aside from the board members here. If you want to just unmute and ask, and if you feel shy, you can write it in the little chat box, and we'll try to. You can address it to one of us, or just put it out to the group. Please do ask.
Here's Lauren.
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, Lauren.
Eva, I want to thank you for bringing in the issue of not belonging as part of our intergenerational trauma, because I've always found it really, really hard to talk at a conference. And I really love being able to understand that in terms of that not belonging history. But I want to actually share a story. And it's not a question, but it's a sharing of a ritual. And again, Eva, thank you for talking about dreams and tarot. I work with a method that I developed called therapy. And it is a ritualistic way of working with people where the ancestors will literally show up either in the dream or they'll show up in the images. And it's a place where there is no split between psyche and matter. That's what's so profound for me about working with dreams or working with something like therapy, because that synchronicity is a place where we meet, where psyche and matter meet. And each time that happens, I think we have a positive shock that breaks through this illusion that we're separate. And one of the things that I found in working with dreams is that we're not separate from the ancestors. These are living presences. And they are coming through our family. For me, personally, I'll talk about it. I just got back from Berlin, where my daughter is now trying to live. And I discovered at the Holocaust Museum, it had never really fully digested in me that both my great-grandmothers on both sides were murdered. One set of great-grandparents in the pogroms and another set in the Holocaust. And my family of origin is completely shattered with divorce and drug addiction and suicide attempts and eventually a suicide. So I'm using therapy and dreams, both with my clients, but also for my own family healing. And it is literally as if a movie is laying out in front of me where the ancestors are coming through and showing how to meet them in a different way. So psychology, the work of psychotherapy has really shifted for me from focusing on the individual as a collective, a complex, to how do we go meet the ancestors? How can we ritualize this? How can we turn to the ancestors for what we're suffering with? And so this is the quick story that my husband is also a child of Holocaust survivors, and 140 members of his family were murdered in the forest in a mass grave in Riga. And dear friends of ours who are German, non-Jewish, a few years ago were going to visit Riga, and they said, you know, do you want anything from Riga? Do you want us to bring you back anything. And he said, no, but what I would really appreciate is if you could go to the forest and if you could do some sort of prayer for my ancestors, for all of the hundreds of thousands of people that were murdered, but specifically my 140 members of my family. And so this dear friend wrote a letter, and they went to the forest, and they did a ritual of prayer, and they buried the letter in the forest. In the next 3 months, things began to happen in my family that changed our life 180 degrees. My husband was applying for German citizenship, and it had been denied to him for 3 years, and all of a sudden the paperwork popped up with nothing of his own efforts. It just popped up after 3 years of being completely dead and denied. And he got his German citizenship back. A building that my father-in-law had built sold without ever going on the market. We changed our home. Things just began to completely transform. And so I'm really working with a very concrete notion that these connections with the archetypes and of image are the portals that connect us to the ancestors. We have ways of seeing them visibly through many, many different portals. And that when we engage with them, it actually transforms our experience in this present physical world.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. That's very beautiful, and I'm so glad you even just bring. I was glad when you just first brought in the idea of ancestors, because that's such an obvious thing, which I've just kind of fluffed over, and you've said it so beautifully. And I'm reminded of I don't know if you've heard of Bert Hellinger. Yeah, he does exactly that kind of work, and it's so beautiful, and it can be, and that's just an example of that. I mean, I've heard so many stories of people who did some piece of work in a structure and then never been able to reconcile with their mother, and during the break her mother calls her, and just things like that, exactly like that. And that prayer story is just so beautiful. Thank you so much. I don't have anything to say, but thanks. It's lovely.
One more quick thing I'll share is, and I'm so grateful for this forum, because being a person who lives between worlds, it's hard to bring sometimes the way of dream, the way of working with the invisible world into the physical world. So these forums are just so helpful to find tribe in this way. But one more quick thing. My husband has worked for 10 years with a group called One by One. And they have gone back to Berlin, and they have a week-long meeting between maybe 8 children of survivors and 8 children of Nazis, 8 children of the Third Reich. And they meet for a week, and they simply tell each other stories. Mm-hmm. And nobody is doing psychotherapy. There's no particular intervention other than the act of listening to one another's stories. And again, synchronicities are profound. What happens to people is profound. And the kind of work that they're doing, I would love to see ways of bringing One by One here. Because obviously we have so many factions in this country right now that we need to hear each other's stories.
Exactly, yeah. Beautiful, thank you.
I just wanted to say that Michael Mead, that's what he's doing at his councils that he's doing. It's extraordinary. I mean, 90 people coming together for 3.5 days and telling their stories. And sometimes they are people who've been rape victims and people who've been rapists. And it's really incredible how through ritual and calling in the ancestors, thank you for bringing that in, is so much a part of that, of calling in the ancestors. And remembering to do that is part of that healing. So it's starting to happen. I guess we're the ones who have to carry that. That's our task. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, and a couple of things I want to mention. It just seems so obvious. One is just that, and I don't know how to operationalize this, is just an observation, which is that so many things that we need and we struggle to integrate into our culture, like calling in the ancestors, like caring about the environment, like as Tom was saying, bringing people together in a circle, taking dreams seriously. These are all things that most indigenous cultures take very, very naturally, and this is why there was often such a disconnect between colonizers and the native people, because they were trying desperately to learn this new Enlightenment way of hyper rationality, and were trying to repress their own natural sense of these things that we all as tribal people once knew. So there's that. The other thing is just, and I feel like I should mention it because it's been present in a lot of the research I've done about this, is simply that there's so much recent, just you and Lauren now have brought in the Holocaust thoughts and this multi-generational trauma that's so, I don't want to say rich, but so present for people whose ancestry has gone through that. Is that Hitler is said to have, in numerous places, not only taken lessons from the reservation system, the United States reservation system, and the way that they, and he was quite impressed with the way that they had wiped out native population, and also the English in the way that they, in the Boer wars in South Africa, had used that. But he also uses a lot of empirical data now on how he studied, and his people under him studied the race laws in the United States, and used them as he slowly integrated more and more restrictive laws throughout the areas that he'd conquered in Europe. So I just say that to show how this sort of karmic, it's not going someplace, even though I'm talking about the perpetrator sort of mentality here, it's not different from Eva, your ancestry and Lauren's ancestry, and what people went through. There's a connection with our culture in the Americas of how that all went. And when thinking about ancestors and ancestry, I think of how those, I don't have an ancestry of that kind of trauma, but I do have an ancestry of people who benefited and kind of slipped into this kind of thing. So somebody will mute, because we're getting a lot of noise from somewhere. Thank you. Any other thought? Tom, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I want to comment on something that Donna raised about the land. And I was actually privileged to have Dr. Duran on my dissertation committee. My work involved the Navajo and the ways in which the narrative of the Long Walk is remembered and told through different cultural perspectives. And it just so happens that this weekend we are celebrating here in New Mexico the 150th anniversary of the release of the Navajo, the liberation of these people from the genocidal conditions that they lived with at the Bosque Redondo, which is now a memorial site. And it's been dedicated as a site of conscience by the National Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which I think is really bringing this whole idea of public engagement to these memorial sites. And, I was reminded last year I took 30 of my students from the University of New Mexico from the Peace Studies program to that memorial site. And I brought in some Navajo youth whose ancestors had been held in captivity there, as well as the Mescalero youth I'd done some work with at an AmeriCorps program out in Mescalero, New Mexico, and brought them together to have them talk to one another. And, my students came away, and after which we did some performance art between the cultures, which I'm glad that Lauren brought up the idea of youth, and what we don't repair here will be passed to that next generation. And from what I could see from a lot of my work and research, that it's been the youth over time that helped change the narrative. because they inherit the traumas, the what's you know what you know that what has ancestral been passed to us to repair. If we don't deal with it, will be passed to them. So I was taken by the collaboration that went on between the youth, the Navajo youth, the Mescalero youth, and my students in terms of sharing narratives, stories, and to go out to the land where all this happened. A lot of my work between cultures now, in terms of reconciling the past, we go to the places where the trauma happened. We don't do this in a third floor conference room somewhere. We go out to the land, and I usually have my students work with the land before we do any of the engagement work. We use some of the parapsychological inquiry work where they inquire of the land, how the land holds the trauma as well. And to liberate the land is, as Dr. Duran talks about, the blood on the land that Donna references, is every bit as important as liberating ourselves from these narratives, these traumatic narratives, and these legacies that are being passed forward. So I just want to bring forward the idea of the Navajo people right now, the Diné, and how this weekend begins their recognition of the release of their ancestors and the genocidal conditions that they lived with, as a result of the Navajo Long Walk, as well as the Mescalero Apache people and what they suffered. So this is a pretty important weekend here in New Mexico. And I just think that those stories are extremely important. And the stories of liberation, the stories of release from captivity on a collective level are every bit as important as our personal stories and our personal dreams. So I think this is a very critical time for us. And one of the things that's informed me lately, one of the pieces I've done for the last 2 years with a colleague of mine through the Jung Institute in Santa Fe is we have now what's called a Film and Dream series. And it's really informing a lot of my own sense of where I'm at in terms of the world and my own belonging to it. Because this year we worked with films, and the theme was collapse and renewal, because I think that's what we're seeing in the culture. And the way we work this is through the Jung Institute. We watch a film together on a Friday night. We don't talk about it. We dream on it. We come back on Saturday morning, and it informs a very different conversation than we normally would have. The film images are brought into the dream state. And so what I'm finding is this is an extraordinary way of building community on a level that I think is considerably deeper than what I've understood it to be in the past. So I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Larry Rayburn, who is a Jungian analyst, who has worked with me in terms of bringing this motif of film and dream into community, and we'll be expanding that. So the role of collective renewal, collective recognizing collapses, and renewal as being on a similar continuum. They're not opposites. They're on a continuum, and that we don't have renewal at some level without some form of collapse, which is what we're seeing now. But sometimes it's very difficult to see the renewal. And I think film is an extraordinary way of getting these images of renewal, particularly emerging during times of collapse. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tom. That's a couple of things you said that really are important, and also that combined with what Lauren and Eva also brought in. But first of all, the idea of collapse and renewal reminds me of a conversation that we had last week when we were preparing this meeting. Was that the idea of, Donna asked me, well, what's your image for this? I need an image. And I said, well, to me, it's more like a seed. When a seed begins to grow, it looks like it's being destroyed, it's collapsing, it's in great agony, and then when it finally sprouts and becomes a new plant, you realize that all that destruction was for the purpose of renewal. It's sort of an image of renewal, so it resonates with what you're saying about collapse and renewal for me. And the other thing is that as you keep emphasizing collective and also with Lauren bringing in the ancestors, the point of, and I should have included this much sooner, but there's so much to think about, but none of us, this kind of massive cultural trauma is not something that any one of us individually can do anything about. We can't carry it. I can't take the responsibility for it. I can't heal it, but it has to be, just as it was collectively enacted, it must be collectively healed, and we need to do it, on this deep archetypal level. And I say that kind of resonating with your starting with the land, the idea of the land holding something has such an archetypal sense of, clearly the land is what we owe everything to. We can't possibly, we're not responsible. It's like with the archetypes. As soon as we begin to think that we're doing something with or to the archetypes, we know we're inflated, because they inhabit us. We can communicate with them, but we cannot be them. If we start to be them, or if we think that we're somehow in possession of them, we're already inflated. And so connecting with the land and connecting with the ancestors and with these big forces in a way that we just say, I'm going to work the best I can, and the rest is up to you, is much healthier than trying to take responsibility for this. I, as a white male, cannot take responsibility for all these huge forces that are around me. I can just do my part to band with others and try to do what we can. And so I really appreciate your contribution there and everyone else's. Anne, I see you have a comment. You want to, Anne? Hi, Anne.
Can you hear me okay?
I can. Great to see you. Glad you're on the call.
Yeah, nice to see you, James. I just want to thank you and all the board members, Mark and Donna, Tom, and Eva and Lauren, for their comments. Really powerful. I just wanted to share a little bit of my experience. Both, you know, Tom had mentioned the power of the land to hold that deep healing process. And also I'm doing a lot of work with a form of active imagination called deep imagery that I just wanted to kind of offer into the circle as a channel for healing some of this generational trauma. But I also wanted to share very quickly just my own personal experience. When I was young, I went out to the Pine Ridge area where Crazy Horse was killed, the Lakota area, with my family on vacation. And I was up there out on the rocks, and I just fell into this really deep grief that was very traumatic, because I could feel the loss and the grief in the land of Indigenous people. So I was probably 11 or 12, and that really changed and molded my entire life. I came back at age 16 to that same area to do my first vision quest, and I began to get a sense of how the land holds all the voices of the ancestors that are still living entities and are available for healing for us. And as an adult, I have also worked with local tribal groups here in the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, in the 90s, I worked with a group who were seeking their federal recognition through the government as a tribe. And as you probably, most of you probably know, that's a really humiliating process for a tribal group to try to prove that they exist. So I think that whether you're Indigenous or not, there's a part of us, you know, as was mentioned earlier, when that feeling level comes up and you're wanting to say, I exist, I belong, where is my place, what is my identity? These are all really core archetypal elements of this healing process. So I'm certified, just recently became certified as a guide for the deep imagery process, which is a form of Jungian active imagination that works directly with both animals and nature archetypes, bringing the inner elements of one's unconscious up into the imaginal realm. And I've done so many journeys myself, as well as guided so many of these journeys. And as a ritualist, I really see the potential value for healing of trauma, for being in the imaginal realm and learning about heartful, embodied relationship with the unconscious, specifically through working with animals, which is, I think, really lovely. So I too am a huge, huge advocate of going out and journeying directly to the land where this trauma is held with the groups of people who know that land most intimately. So I'd love to stay in touch with people who are doing that work directly with people, and if there's any way I can be of service, I'm available.
Thanks. Could you just maybe in the chat put that name again of that method you said was an active imagination method?
It's called Deep Imagery. I'll be glad to.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I appreciate it also that you brought up the animals. I mean, the working with animals is just there's all kinds of empirical data now of how bringing animals into retirement homes and into hospitals and just care facilities, and of course, just living with animals puts people on a completely different level. It's very much easier to be close to that realm. When you are, if you're unable to communicate with animals, then you're going to have a difficult time communicating with the unconscious. That's my opinion. So I welcome others. We've made our kind of had a commitment to do an hour, and we've done that. I certainly want to keep entertaining questions or thoughts or comments from anyone. But if you feel I see Gail. It looks like I see that. I'm not as aware of all these chats. Things, but I see that Gail has her hand up. Gail, you still have a question or a comment or a thought?
Yes, I have all three of those.
Oh, good. Hi, Gail.
So
how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm so grateful to all of you for taking up this topic. I have ancestry of Selagi people on the East Coast, native red race, the true red race. We're also known as Cherokee, but my people use our original name for ourselves because we resisted both the removal and the reservation by hiding in these mountains, which are the oldest on this continent. And there's a strong sense of the land here, and there's a lot of work, and I really want to thank Tom for bringing in that experience of his interaction in a native way, because my own experience is very similar. My brother was murdered 24 years ago this month as a judge in the line of duty at the courthouse, and also as a native man. And the murderer was perpetrator ancestry, and I had been blessed with preparation synchronistically of a Jungian study group. I was 3 levels into Journey into Wholeness at the time, and that was my preparation. And then my brother came to me in dream time, and he showed me his healing on the other side, and he shared so much with me that I came to realize that our work continues on the other side, not only with our ancestors, but with our own spirit. And this union work has been so helpful for me in coming to a place of understanding, a place where I can now hold ceremonies on the south end of this mountain range, just the oldest on this continent. And I can open those ceremonies of the Nipikada Satyaj ceremony to people of all cultures. And I've shared with well over 100 millennials. That's who shows up, the millennials. People bring their friends, and we have a core community. And I can share with them, what I learned in dream time and take them through the ritual. For example, a true vision quest is where your community will eat and drink for you for 4 days. It's not just a camping trip. It's not going on to a place in the land. Even Jung, in his work, he speaks of us as primitive in the way of being more about community than individuation, but is there acknowledgement that we individually bring our gifts, our true gifts. And even Melodam Some teaches us how to bring our gifts in the African way into our community. In the original shamanic way, the soul was not retrieved to the individual. It was retrieved and brought back into the community. So there are so many ways, even though, when I grew up, we were forced into assimilation. It was illegal to speak our language. I'm mixed heritage. My father's descendant of Marie Antoinette, and he was a district attorney at the time. So we couldn't speak our language, but we were raised in our ways. He was very respectful of those ways, and a part of the Masonic Lodge, which also recognized our ways and our rituals. And even in assimilation, the most important thing we were taught was how to pass the light. But it stopped short of taking us to church. So we were not exposed to the patriarchy in that way. And, I have some stories from my adolescence where I tried to figure out why I didn't have any friends to play with on Sunday morning. Showed up in church a couple of times, but I'll save that for someone. But I really appreciate what is happening here, and I believe that the depth psychology way and the Jungian way is a way of coming together. And we come together as equal cohorts, and we share our true ways with understanding. There's so much interpretation that's just not quite there. But the depth psychology is the place that understands it the best of all my 61 years of experience. So I thank you all, and I just want to bring my ancestors into this discussion and participate in any way that I'm asked.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks for, I didn't know all that about you, and I've known you for a while, but I appreciate you sharing all that. And yeah, your mic was breaking up a little bit. I don't know why that is, but I could hear most of what you were saying. But I really appreciate that. I wonder if are you familiar with Vine Deloria Jr.'s book on Jung and the Sioux? Yeah, he really, he kind of shows where some of those dovetailings are and where some of the problems are that they don't dovetail exactly, but it's a lovely articulation of that. That's a similar reason I like, are you familiar with Charles Eastman? He's another Sioux who had been, Ohiesa, who I just adore him. I just think he's wonderful. But I'm so glad to learn all that about you and about your history, and I'm so sorry about your brother. Wow, but I'm glad you had that experience.
It's been a gift. Thank you. And again, DNA is not recognizing the red race on the East Coast. It's recognizing the West Coast through East Asian and Native American, but that's yellow race. Mm-hmm. There's a difference. And our stories and our experiences are different. We are truly one in unity, deep down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. And I'm just trying to see if I see any other hands raised. I don't see any other hands raised, but thank you, Gail, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, there were a couple of people who had something to say. Bridget, I believe, and some, is that right, Bridget?
Yes, I'm here.
Thanks, Egypt. Thanks, Shiva. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, I'm calling from Spain. I'm German. I needed to get away from Germany when I was 25. I didn't know why, but I felt very uncomfortable there, and it was in Spain that I trained as a practitioner of somatic pattern recognition, and working with the way experience is organized in the body. I found out that why I had to leave Germany. It was because I needed a perspective on German history and begin to carry the share of the collective guilt that Germans have to carry. And I have found a way through the work as a practitioner of somatic pattern recognition to work through the the experience, the feelings, the way my ancestors' experience is organized in my body, and to release some of the deep feelings of guilt and transform it into service. And also, I very much appreciate what, I don't know who it was earlier who said that the wealth of Europe is very much based on the exploitation of American prime, what was it, gold and silver, and I think it's more than gold and silver.
No, but that was an early manifestation of it.
Yeah. And now I'm very much aware of how the conflict that is going on in Spain and between Spain and Catalonia is also rooted in the trauma of guilt, of not recognized guilt, unconscious guilt. And so I'm working on one hand, one-on-one, in the way with individual people, how the experience is organized in the body, becoming aware of the relationship with the gravitational fields so that we can open up the space in our body and really experience a deep connection with the environment, with our environment, through feeling the support of the earth and the emotions of breathing. And through the direct experience of the somatic experience of feeling the contact with the ground and the space around through breathing, makes it possible to what's the word? To manage the feelings that are partly our own, but are rooted also in the experience our parents have not been able to work through, be it trauma as a victim or trauma as a perpetrator.
That's beautifully said. Thank you. That really resonates with what Tom was saying about the land and working from the land up. And to me, it's just very poignant. I'm very sorry that you felt you had to leave Germany because of that sense of all that German history. And yet there are people on this continent that could use a little consciousness of that seem to be blissfully, completely unaware. Still have this sort of victor mentality, like we did a great thing.
Yeah, Spaniards do too.
Yeah, there were a lot of people do, I guess. And that's, as I was saying earlier, that's something that just as humans, this is how human culture has been for millennia. Since the Neolithic age, when people first learned how to plant crops and to hoard crops, and so then there began this differentiation and this sense of somebody could have more than someone else. And since then, there's been this strain of going off into what the Buddhists call the grasping and the greed mentality. But whatever, I appreciate you sharing that, because that is something that it is everywhere, and we're all working towards it. And I'm sorry you experienced it so acutely, but you're.
I'm glad I did, because it really opened a way for me to work in a very meaningful way and make a contribution to many people's life that is very helpful.
Yes, and you call it the somatic.
It's called the Doug French approach to somatic pattern recognition. I'll write it down in the chat, and we have a website. And
oh, great. No, I'd like to learn more about it. Thank you.
It actually comes from Annie Duggan, is in Seattle. She is one of the creators. The other was Janie French, who passed away some years ago.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Bridget.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. So do we have any other questions? We're running out of time. I want to maybe go around and just have closing words from the panel. Was there one more? Eva, you said there was another person had something that they wanted to ask or say? Yes, no? If not, does anyone want some closing words? Tom, Eva, Donna, and Mark? Just a sentence or two?
I would add one thing that I want to riff on something that you mentioned
Sure.
on this one, James, and that is the role of animals. About 5-6 years ago, I started using what they call in these, they're called courthouse dogs. They're trained to deal with trauma and safe house interviews for kids. And I started using them in these big restorative circles on crimes of big impact.
Yeah.
And these dogs were absolutely amazing. When I would, these are very volatile when you had victims and perpetrators in the room. And to sit the dog in the center of the circle and just the energy of this dog just chills everybody out. And when there's healing, I just remember she would get up out of the center and go to whoever is having the feeling, put her head in the lap of who's ever telling the story at that particular point in time, where feeling is affective states of being accessed. And it was just
that's so sweet. Wow.
Amazing.
Thank
to
you.
watch how these dogs work. So I want to give a shout out to the animal world.
Oh, thank
and
you.
Both in the imaginal world and the literal world, and the gifts that they bring to us. And I want to thank all the folks who contributed to that. It's so inspiring to hear the many ways that this work is being integrated in various ways, shapes, and forms.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Tom. I echo your thing, and thank you very much for all you've contributed. Donna, you have anything for us as we close out?
I just wanted to encourage that we're going to lose a lot of the links here on Zoom, and invite you all, those of you that are on Facebook, to join the Depth Psychology Alliance and post there, and or go directly to the website so that we can continue the dialogue that we started today. That's what I wanted to say, because my heart is full. I've learned so much. I'm so grateful for everybody here, and I think this is a good beginning. But I'd love to see us do some more. And that's just one of the ways we can start right away to continue.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah, and thank you so much for your contributions. And I will commit that I'm going to be gone for the summer, but when I get back, definitely we'll do some part 2, multi-generational trauma part 2. I enjoyed this very much too. Thank you. Mark?
Just thank you for those last couple of closing reflections about land and body and animal and imagination. This is great work, meaningful connection between what's below the surface, what's hidden in our lives, connecting to the reality of what's showing up in our lives. So important to tend. Just really grateful for you all, and look forward to seeing you wherever we can show up together. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your contributions. And thank your bear. Next time you see the bear, thank the bear for us. Not too close up, but from a distance. Eva, you got anything for us?
Same thing. Thank you so much. I learned so much today. I took a lot of notes. Thank you so much of you. So much incredible work, and it all intersects. And then thank you again for the reminding us about the animals, which, our soul connections, our direct connections to the land, to the feeling function. Thank you so much for doing this, James, and for everybody who participated. I'm so grateful to see you all. I'm always amazed at and in awe and grateful that we can come together in this way from different parts of the world. It's just such a gift.
Yeah, and thank you, Eva, for bringing up your family history that really awakened something that I never even imagined would be present, was that there was such a cross sense of feeling between European multi-generational Holocaust genocide trauma and the trauma and the American. I mean, I kind of had this abstract sense of, you know, knowing about Hitler's weird connection and all that stuff, but I hadn't realized that that this call would attract people who had a connection to that, and I'm grateful for that, and I'm very grateful to everybody who brought that to the call, and I hope you all will remain active in conversation on this and do what we can. Thank you so much, Tom and Donna and Mark and Eva, and we will continue this as we go on. Thank you all very much. And I will post this on either today or tomorrow on the Depth Psychology Alliance, this tape of this. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.